Hi everyone, welcome to my living room, brought to you by Meyer and Mintz LLC. I'm Dr. Colleen Meyer, host. We have an amazing guest today. I had him on my other podcast, Fearless in Pink. You guys, this is an amazing story, and this is Jeff Deskovic. Did I get it right?
Deskovic.
Ah, I think I had it close. Jeff is an internationally recognized expert on wrongful convictions and the founder of Jeffery Deskovic Foundation for Justice, which has freed 11 wrongfully convicted people and helped pass 8 laws. Jeff is also an advisory board member of the coalition group It Could Happen to You. He sits on the Global Advisory Council of Restorative Justice International and is a co-owner of the Recharge Beyond the Bar reentry game, which facilitates the formerly incarcerated connecting with their family and friends. So, Jeff, do you want to tell us a little bit about your story? I know that you can go on Amazon Prime and watch your story there called Conviction, but can you just kind of give us a firsthand experience and the firsthand story?
Yeah, of course. So I was 16 years old. It was in Westchester County, New York. It was the suburbs, and I was arrested for murder and rape, which I did not commit. I turned 17 years old, and before the trial started, and where, despite a pretrial negative DNA test result, I was wrongfully convicted, with the conviction being caused by a coerced false confession, prosecutorial misconduct, fraud by the medical examiner, terrible public defender. I was given a 15 to life sentence. I lost 7 appeals. I got turned down for parole. And ultimately, I was exonerated through further DNA testing via the DNA data bank, which not only didn't match me, but also identified the actual perpetrator whose DNA was in the data bank, because left free while I was doing time for his crime, he killed a second victim 3.5 years later, who was a school teacher and had 2 children after he killed the victim in my case.
Jeff, if they started questioning you when you or this crime happened, you were 16 years old. So obviously they had tried you as an adult in an adult court.
Yes, they did. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, they did. They did arrest me as an adult. They charged me as an adult, and as a result of that, my case was heard in the adult justice system, and I was therefore sent to an adult maximum security prison.
So um, there's a lot. When I look at your story and I've heard your story, there's so many things in this from the beginning till you're at the age of 33, getting out of jail 33. There were so many things that went wrong in your case, from the way the interrogation was handled to ignoring DNA. You could talk about your other things, and then I know that nobody wanted to hear you when you went up for appeal. Nobody wanted to hear it.
Right. So I'll unpack that a bit. So most people think that an innocent person would never confess, but actually, coerced false confessions have caused wrongful convictions in 25% of the DNA proven wrongful convictions. And while adults have given coerced false confessions, particularly vulnerable populations are youth, of which I was one, and people with mental health problems. So I got on the police radar initially because the police interviewed a lot of students from the high school, and some of them told the police that they might want to speak with me. That was because I was quiet and to myself. I was kind of on the fringes of the society there in the high school. A follow-up thing was that I was a sensitive teenager. This was really my first brush with death, and I had an emotional reaction. And the police thought that it was suspicious that I would have an emotional reaction over the death of a classmate that I really barely knew. Although, in a broader context, this really affected everybody in the city of Peekskill. It was a small city, approximately 25,000 people, and murders were rare. So it affected everybody enough to the point that free mental health counseling was set up in Peekskill to anyone who wanted it. A couple of other things to know, which is that I came from a single parent household. My father was never involved in my life in any aspect, and that intersected with the good cop, bad cop technique, in which one officer was pretending to be my friend, and I began to look up to him as a father figure. And another thing is that prior to being a teenager, I wanted to be a cop when I grew up. So for about 6 weeks, the police played this cat and mouse game with me, in which half the time they would speak to me as if I was a suspect, and the other half the time they would pretend like they needed my help to solve the crime. They would say things like, the kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear anything. Stop in from time to time. They'd ask me opinion questions and congratulate me that my opinion was correct. Eventually, they got me to agree to take a polygraph test by telling me that some new information had come in, and they wanted to their file, and they wanted to share that with me. But I would first have to take and pass a polygraph test. So the next day, rather than report to the school, I went to the police station because it was a school day. My mother and grandmother thought that I was in school, so they didn't call around looking for me. They drove me to from Peekskill, which is in Westchester County. They drove me 40 minutes away by car to the town of Brewster in Putnam County. So that meant I couldn't leave anymore on my own. I was totally dependent upon the police. I had no attorney present. I wasn't given anything to eat the entire time I was there. The polygraphist himself was a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator, and he was dressed like a civilian. He was pretending not to be law enforcement. So he gave me a 4-page brochure which explained how the polygraph worked, but then it had a lot of big words in it that I didn't understand. But I figured, well, I'm there to help the police. So what does it matter? Let's just get on with it. From there, he put me in a small room and gave me countless cups of coffee in order to get me nervous. And from there, he launched it. He attached me to the machine, and then he launched into his third-degree tactics. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. And as each hour passed, my fear increased in proportion to the time. Towards the end of the interrogation, he said to me, and this was after 6.5 to 7 hours of interrogation, he said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the test results that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." And so that really shot my fear through the roof. And at that point, the officer who had been pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he'd been holding them off, but that he could not do so any longer, that I had to help myself. Then he added, "Look, just tell them what they want to hear. You can go home afterwards. You're not going to be arrested." So being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long term, just being concerned with my safety in the moment, I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was and no one else knew where I was either loomed quite large. Then there was this push-pull dynamic, the threat and then the false promise. So I made the decision to make up a story based on the information which he had given me in the course of the interrogation. By the time everything was said and done, I collapsed on the floor in a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. Obviously, I was arrested. I was charged with a murder and rape.
You know what? Uh, what part? There's a lot that you can try and unpack. But what would upset me as a mother or grandmother would be, or person, is why do you have my child taking my child somewhere and talking to my 16-year-old without me being know that the child's there, without me knowing, so I can't be there, and why is he being taken far away to where, and I'm assuming you felt this way, you felt isolated. I'm
Yes.
away from people. I can't get home without these people.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt isolated. Uh, but beyond that, I just want to share with people, that if you're 16 years old, then you're considered to be an adult for the purpose of being able to waive your rights and speak to the police without an attorney and without a parent. So it is important that, as parents, that we do teach our children that the police want to speak with you, that you give them your name and where you live, but after that you ask for a lawyer. You never speak to the police without an attorney. But the innocence of suspects often works against them, and they think, well, why do I need a lawyer for? I didn't do anything. And they think nothing can happen. And they also worry that that will make them look guilty. But actually, it's very important to insist on having an attorney present, and that will prevent the police from coercing you. I mean, I didn't know any better. I believed in these false concepts that I'm mentioning to you, and ultimately it cost me 16 years of my life. And just on a similar basis, you never agreed to allow the police to search your car or search your home. You just make clear, look, I'm not giving you permission to search. So if you search, you don't have my consent. Then you step out of the way, let them search. You never physically stop them from trying to do the search, but you never agree either. You just say, I'm opposed to you searching. So that this way you bring it up in court later.
Now, Jeffrey, let's play devil's advocate for a minute. Uh,
Yeah.
what if a someone listening says, well, if you don't allow, if you're straight away asking for an attorney, or you say you're not going to search my car, um, that tells the police that you might be guilty, but that's not always the obviously the case, right? So how would you answer people who might play the devil's advocate?
I would say there's a reason why we have, why we have a Fifth Amendment, why we have a Fourth Amendment. You need to ask for a lawyer. It doesn't matter if first. I don't think that they're going to necessarily look at you as you're guilty, but it doesn't. More importantly, it doesn't matter if they do. So what? They look at you like they're guilty. They look at you like they're guilty. You're not going to talk your way out of it. If they're determined to arrest you, they're only trying to get statements from you to add to the case. You're not going to talk your way out of it. Whereas if you do ask for a lawyer, the conversation can proceed from there, and the lawyer will make sure that they don't coerce you.
That's
And I would
exactly.
apply the line of reasoning as to the, searching your home. Just look, I don't consent. That's the magic word. Look, I do not consent to you searching my home. I do not consent to you searching my vehicle.
You know, that's true, because as you're speaking, I'm thinking in my head. So if you have an attorney, if you're an innocent person, you have an attorney present, and that's just to make sure that everything's on the up and up, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Because that's why we have that law, that we
Right.
can have the right to have an attorney present.
Yeah, that whole case law was developed. That whole decision, Miranda versus Arizona, where more of us you get your Miranda rights, right, from
Right.
television culture. That whole decision came about because the police were psychologically coercing people, and case after case after case after case after case. That's why that whole law was created basically by the court.
You know what I found? Looking at cases and doing reading about cases, a lot of times we have a hard time having another judge hear it. They don't once it's like once they convict, they don't want to hear it anymore. Going to go, whether
Yes.
you're innocent or guilty. But to me, if there's a chance, if there's a small chance that somebody is innocent, or a big chance somebody's innocent, we as a judicial system owes it to them to hear their case again.
I agree with you completely. We definitely owe that. Speaking to that point, that's what's called finality of conviction. In other words, it's the idea, look, you had your day in court, you lost, are we going to be going through this forever? And in a way that makes sense. But again, whenever there's an objective reason to look at a case again, then being as though the whole point of the judicial system is to punish the guilty, whereas the innocent go free, then it should be reviewed. And really that finality of conviction, that reluctance to overturn a conviction and thinking about what are the time, what's the money, what's the energy that went into the case in the first place, and now we're going to have to do that all over again, another trial. That type of concern really is why by the time most people are exonerated, their appeals have long since been over with. The average length of wrongful incarceration is 14 years. There's 2,839 exonerations listed by the National Registry of Exoneration just from 1989 forward. So my case is not rare. So when you look at the appeal process, using my case really quickly as an example, now, I had the issue that I was, my rights were violated by the way I'd been questioned, that I was innocent based on the DNA, that there was legally insufficient
Yeah.
evidence. Verdict was against the weight of the evidence, that the prosecution hadn't proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And a total of 10 issues were filed. So the court ruled, get a load of this now, the court ruled that I was free to come and go, which totally ignored the whole thing that I'm totally dependent on the cops. And they ruled that the statements were voluntary. They wrote that there was overwhelming evidence of guilt, which doesn't make any sense. This DNA didn't match me. And they got rid of all the rest of my issues in one sentence by writing that they had looked at my remaining issues and found them to all either be without merit or not preserved for review. And they ruled against me 5-0. And it was all downhill from there. The re-argument motion was denied in one word, denied. The New York State Court of Appeals declined to give me permission to appeal to them, so I lost there that way. I lost in federal court because the court clerk gave my lawyer the wrong information pertaining to the filing procedure. So my petition arrived 4 days too late, which the court ruled that I was late and never even reached my issues. and that decision was upheld in the next 3 courts. So that's 7 appeals that I lost. So that's clearly this idea of finality of conviction and this maddening focus or emphasis on procedure rather than substantive justice. What do I mean by that? Why did it matter? Why did it matter that my petition arrived 4 days too late? Isn't that beside the point? Isn't that something to take up with my defense lawyer if she missed the deadline? Why should the outcome be that my innocence claim and my issue about being coerced in a confession, that I don't get to have a ruling on any of those things anymore? None of that even matters. None of that will even be considered. The only thing is that we're deciding this case because you were late. That's an example of proceduralism over substantive justice.
And I don't know how they got around the DNA didn't match yours. So how did they address that? Did your defense attorney address that? Say, hey, wait a minute, it's not my guy. The DNA says it's not my guy. Or
All
did
right, so
Jace?
okay. So at the trial, the way that they got around that is the district attorney, the prosecutor, got the medical examiner to commit fraud. He claimed once the DNA didn't match me, he then suddenly claimed, well, I remember that I forgot to document medical evidence which showed that the victim had been sexually active, which is what allowed the prosecutor to argue that it didn't matter that the DNA didn't match me. That didn't mean I was innocent. That just meant that there was yet another person that she must have slept with prior to my murdering and raping her. Taking it a step further, he mentioned another youth by name that he claimed had had sex with the victim. But the issue, though, is that he never tried to prove that. He never called this other individual as a witness. He never got a DNA sample to prove that. And he got away with that because of two things. Firstly, the victim's family was not coming to court, so they had no idea that her reputation was being trashed in that way. And secondly, my lawyer allowed them to get away with that. He never explained to the jury what the significance of the DNA was not matching me. He never used that to argue that proved that the confession was coerced and false. He let the prosecutor get away with this argument by inference rather than forcing him to present evidence to do that. He never cross-examined this medical examiner. And lastly, he had a conflict of interest, which intersected with this issue, which is that this other youth that the prosecutor was falsely saying had slept with the victim was represented by another public defender in that office, and specifically by the public defender that was supposed to be supervising him on my case. And so that conflict prevented the defense from asking him to give a sample. It prevented the defense from calling him as a witness. So that was their way around it at the trial. On appeal, the district attorney's office, I remember one of the argument at the appellate division they wrote was they said that a negative DNA test result is no insulation to a guilty verdict, which is kind of a stunning statement in and of itself, and they just stayed with that and used the technicality on the last the last 4 appeals was just about the technicality that I was late. And I was blocked several times at getting further DNA samples. When the DNA data bank was created back in 1997, 98, the district attorney at the time, Janine Pirro, there was another Westchester County case where she agreed that the defendant, Cherry Chalmers, was innocent based on the DNA test. And she did a lot of media around that, defending her decision, explaining to the public what DNA not matching somebody meant. So I wrote a letter and said, well, what about this old case in your file? The DNA doesn't match me either. I'm innocent. I'd like to get further testing. But they wouldn't give me the testing. And then that was put into the federal court documents, which they fought against as well.
So you're in jail all this time. So how did it finally come where somebody said to you, you know what, this kid's now he's a man. This man is innocent. He was wrongly convicted. The DNA doesn't match. So how did that process start, and who started it?
I started that process. So I did the 7 appeals, which I already outlined. That took me 11 years. Once your appeals are over, the only way back into court is if you can find some previously unknown evidence of innocence, which probably would have resulted in a different outcome. I had no money to hire an attorney or an investigator to find new evidence. Hence, I started a letter writing campaign looking for help. Anyone that could help me either directly or indirectly. Ultimately, one of those letters, which I sent to a book author in care of a publishing company, was instead sent to Claudia Whitman, who was an investigator. When I sent her the paperwork proving that the DNA didn't match me, she instantly believed that I was innocent. So that was really the key. So she suggested that I write the Innocence Project looking for their representation. She lobbied them outside their organization. She got other respected legal entities to also lobby them. And then I got lucky that one of the intake workers, Maggie Taylor, who's an attorney now, she presented my case a total of 3 times to the lawyers at the Innocence Project because they didn't want to take the case because I already had been excluded by the DNA. But ultimately, her idea, the DNA database, which is an idea I suggested to her, was how they could do something with the DNA and it still be something new. So getting their representation was the key. Second key was Janine Pirro left office and her successor was willing to let me get the testing that Pirro was not. And the third key was that we got lucky that the actual perpetrator's DNA was in the data bank. So I went from being able to say that it didn't match me, but it matched him. It's him.
And the him went out and killed somebody else.
Yes. Yeah. His DNA was only in the data bank because he killed a second victim 3.5 years later. So the DNA matched him, then confronted with that evidence, he confessed he was the person who committed the crime. So my conviction was overturned. And at the next court appearance, the charges were all dismissed on actual innocence grounds. And he was arrested and pled guilty for the crime.
This is frustrating to me because, I have 2 grown daughters and I have a teenage, 13-year-old granddaughter. And if they didn't have tunnel vision, if they follow the DNA, this person who died after the fact, after you were convicted, would still be alive or possibly would still be alive today. And as a parent, it's upsetting to me that justice was not served to the original victim, to you, and to the second victim and her family until later. And it took you and the Innocence Project to get this justice for this original victim and for yourself.
Yeah, and just to build off of your point, to support your point, Colleen, I want to share the audience that as a result of wrongful convictions, that an aggregate of 154 additional violent crimes were committed by perpetrators who remained on the street, whereas innocent people were convicted. And the breakdown of that would be 36 additional murders, 83 sexual assaults, and 35 additional violent crimes. So it is a big public safety issue with very real implications.
And it's not just those numbers that you're talking about, it's those numbers. Yes, and their families, and it's a trickle down. It spreads across all these other people's lives that are getting destroyed. That's a shocking and a sad commentary about some of the certain part of our justice system. Now, but you took lemons and made lemonade,
Right.
and so tell us what you're doing now, what you did with your life since you got out.
Sure. So when I was released, I became for 5 years, I was an individual advocate. So I was speaking across the country. I was a weekly columnist. I was trading privacy for awareness by doing media interviews, and I was meeting with elected officials. I got a scholarship from Mercy College to finish the bachelor's degree because I had gotten an associate's in a year towards the bachelor's while I was wrongfully incarcerated. So I got the bachelor's degree. I got a master's degree. My thesis is on wrongful conviction cause and reform. And after about 5 years, I was financially compensated. And I took $1.5 million from that and started the Jeffery Deskovic Foundation for Justice. whose purpose is to free wrongfully convicted people. So we've been able to free 11 wrongfully convicted people. We've helped to pass, thank you, we hope to pass 8 laws, 3 of them just as an organization, the other 5 in a bigger coalition called It Could Happen to You, which I'm part of. I am on the Global Advisory Council for Restorative Justice International. And at some point, it became not enough for me to sit in the front row of the courtroom. I wanted to be able to represent some of the clients. I wanted to be able to sit at the defense table and make some of the arguments, hence becoming an attorney in pursuit of the dream
Wow.
of representing others as a lawyer.
Yeah, and you're going to make a difference in the world, and you've seen firsthand about what happens when
Justice goes on.
and poor quality of representation and effort and all of those things combined. It's like a perfect storm, and it affected. To me, you're 16's a child to me.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it definitely is. But like you said, though, I mean, I've taken the lemons. I made lemonade out of it. My mission in the world, my purpose in the world is to free people in the same position I was in, to do some work on the preventative side and do some work on the just general justice reform issues. A lot of disturbing things I saw up close and personal that I either experienced or saw happen to other people: solitary confinement or worthy candidates of parole turned down, the terrible medical care, over sentencing of many people. I saw people in prison that were doing 20, 30 years for a small amount of drug possession, an arbitrary amount that made something a felony rather than a misdemeanor. And they had more time than people that were there for murder or assault, or burglary, robbery, arson. I mean, that seemed backwards to me as well. So hence those issues meaning something to me, but in looking at mission in life, and I have doing this advocacy work, it's meaningful, it's healing, it's cathartic. I have a sense of inner peace. I make sense of what happened to me in that kaleidoscopic way. And maybe the other aspect of that is, I'm often asked, well, are you angry? And my answer is no. And my lines of reasoning are that I want to enjoy my life as much as I can, and I can't do that if I'm angry or bitter. I feel like I lost so much as is. Why would I want to, in effect, lose the rest of my life? And really, if I was angry bitter, I would really be the only loser in that scenario. It's not like I'd be negatively impacting the people involved in what happened to me if I was. And the vehicle that allows me to actualize that is I take that energy that I would feel and I channel it into the advocacy work that I do.
Now, if someone wanted to get a hold of you or get involved with your foundation, what would be the best way?
Well, the website, www.deskovic.org, Deskovic. There's a web form there. People can email me through that. I'm on social media, so I have LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. We do have a crowdfunding site on the Patreon website. My dream, imagine, Colleen, what if 25,000 people were willing to sacrifice $3 or $5 a month on a recurring monthly basis? We would be able to free more wrongfully convicted people, work on more cases. We'd be able to do policy work in more than just New York, Pennsylvania, and California. So people donating, word of mouth, social media, spreading that as well are helpful. And look, I do public speaking around the country and internationally. I have the honorariums made out to the foundation as a minor income stream of it to continue our policy work. So those are all ways that people can assist and get involved.
Well, I put your website inside the chat box. So if anybody, and then of course, we'll go ahead and whatever you send me as far as other information, I'll put it inside and get that to people too. So Jeffrey, this is the second time I've had you on. I love having you come and talk about your experiences, bringing to light some of the problems that we have in our judicial system, and telling your story. It takes a lot of courage, I think, to get out there and all the wonderful work that you're doing, and you're touching lives, and that is so much appreciated in the lives of those people. But to me, and I'm sure some of my listeners, because we think the same way you do, why would we should never in any country, but I'm talking about this country, we should never ever have anybody in jail that's sitting in jail innocent. Never should be happening.
100%. But we need people. Look, that's why I'm really happy you shared your platform with me today and help me to amplify my voice. And really important that as it's very important for everybody to vote candidates into office of either party that are for justice reform. Let's vote the people out to stand in the way of those reforms. And anybody can contact their elected official, their senator, their assembly person. Hey, I want this system. I want this law or that law, passed. I want interrogations to be videotaped. I want the best practices when it comes to identification. I demand that evidence be preserved so that it can be tested. Hey, I want money to be spent on public defense. So if we have this lopsided system where the public defender's office has scant resources compared to the DA's office, then how can I have confidence in the outcome? So we need to push for all those reforms. And look, that this is about justice and accuracy. It has nothing to do whatsoever with being soft on crime. It has nothing to do with putting rights of criminals over rights of victims. We're saying that we need to have an accurate system so that we can be more assured, we can have more confidence in the outcome that guilty people are convicted and punished, but that innocent people are not. And we need for people to stop getting out of jury duty, you know, serve on the jury and really hold the prosecution to their burden of proof. If they prove it, then you convict. But if they don't prove it, it doesn't matter if you think the defendant did it. If they didn't prove it, you have to still vote not guilty. Maybe the last thing I'll mention, in terms of thinking about justice reform as about justice and accuracy, it's not anti law enforcement. You know, Let me say this: that look, I've met a lot of good people in the police and prosecutors. I think that they're essential. I co-teach the ethics class twice a year for the last 7.5 years to police cadets in New Jersey. I've spoken in front of district attorney offices and groups of prosecutors, and in front of groups of judges as well. I categorically reject the idea that it's a few bad apples. It's a lot more than that. There wouldn't be 2,839 exonerations from 1989 forward, recalling that that's the people that made it out. We wouldn't see these disgusting examples of police brutality, unjustifiable deadly police force. So it's not a few bad apples. At the same time, it's not everybody in those professions either. There's both good and bad in that profession. I reject the idea of defund the police. If I have an emergency and I call 911, I got to tell you, Colleen, I don't want to be put on hold. I want there to be a police department that can take the call. And as much as I like people in the mental health profession, I don't want you showing up when I have an emergency. I'd rather have a law enforcement officer showing up. Thank you. But I do want better training in dealing with people that have, mental health crisis, better training on that. And absolutely, we have to have accountability when people take the authority that they're given, the trust that we're given to them as a society, and then they abuse it, then we definitely need to hold people to account. And speaking of mental health, I saw a disturbing number of prisoners while I was wrongfully incarcerated that had significant mental health issues. I mean, people were, given Thorazine and Meneril and other drugs, and it just seemed to me so clear. These people did not belong in prison. They belonged into a mental hospital where they could receive, proper training. That's not by mental health professionals, not the prison guards. And so that's another aspect of injustice that really goes on, not directly related to guilt, innocence, but a significant
Mhm.
issue. I mean, just like I saw the terrible medical care in prison, and how elderly people were in prison, and how they that already in that medical medical care given was particularly not suited for people that were elderly. So
Mm.
elderly people on parole, I think, is another issue for me as well.
But Jeffrey, thank you so much. I think as you're talking, I was talking to a woman this morning that is in the mental health field, and her and I were having the same conversation this morning. So I think it would be really an interesting conversation and get some mental health people together and have you come on and talk about the lack. And she was in Canada, but the Canadians are having the same problems we're having, which is a lack of mental health facilities and services to people. And what they're, people are are self-medicating on drugs, and then they're ended up in jails, and it's just,
Yeah, there's a
it's
lot of intersections. That would be an intriguing conversation. As you know, I would always be up for coming on any platform that you are a host, co-host, or even a guest of. So yeah, I think that would be an intriguing conversation. And the same thing, in terms of, what are the mental health crossovers? What are the challenges from a psychological point of view when it comes to reintegrating back into society and
Mhm.
putting some color to the idea that when people are exonerated, we just release them with nothing, with no governmental assistance at all, kind of like reintroducing an animal out into the wilderness. And even places that do financially compensate, that's often a process that takes 2 3 years or more than that, whereas there should be immediate assistance provided, things like housing, cost of living, mental health services, doctor, dental, access to public transportation, job training, job placement, classes on technology. But lots of fertile ground to talk about, even as to, what are the normal psychological after effects of being wrongfully incarcerated. We kind of get into that as well. So lots of crossovers, and let's make it happen.
All right, sounds good. All right, everyone. Well, thank you, Jeffrey, for being on. Welcome to my living room. We appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you as well. And thank you everyone for tuning in and listening.